Chris Hewins is a principal advisor in the food and beverage team within MPI New Zealand Food Safety. He contributes technical advice towards developing food standards and food safety tools with food businesses and their auditors. He currently leads the New Zealand Food Safety Other Ways to Verify project that seeks alternative ways for gaining assurance about food safety and business culture practices. Chris previously led environmental health and food safety teams in the UK and New Zealand, ran a consultancy business contracting to the UK Meat Hygiene Service and Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Welcome, Chris. We look forward to your presentation. I can see your slides perfectly.
Thank you, Tim. Tēnā koutou. Thanks for the opportunity to offer a little insight into New Zealand food safety development and use of technology for seeking assurance about food safety, what we term remote verification, and developing remote verification framework. And thank you, Pavel, for a number of interesting aspects around gathering assurance through remote auditing that you've been researching, and hopefully might be able to fill in one or two shaded areas for taking a sort of a practical approach to looking at the remote audit. I don't know how many of you will have either delivered or been on the receiving end of a remote audit, but irrespective of this, over the past couple of years, we've experienced a significant increase in our use of technology in everyday life, and technology has often been the only way for us to see and hear from others in the outside world during the COVID pandemic. And we've all become pretty experienced with attending online gatherings such as this, and I'm sure we've all become aware of some of the limitations and pitfalls that come with communicating through technology rather than in person, as well as many of the benefits. I work with New Zealand Food Safety, a group that's part of the Ministry for Primary Industries, and New Zealand Food Safety sets and administers food safety standards that implement the Food Act, Wine Act, Animal Products Act, and Australia and New Zealand Food Standards Code. Back in 2018, we were in the middle of a 3-year program to implement the Food Act 2014, which phased in some 45,000 food businesses around the country to operate under the new food rules. And each of these businesses needed to be registered and get themselves verified. And at that stage, we hadn't been thinking too much about the use of technology, other than to provide a registration platform and online tools to help people identify where their food business fitted under a risk-based system. But one of the guiding principles of the Food Act is to find ways to minimise compliance costs for food businesses. And in the registration and verification space, we live in a user-pay society, and the time spent by the verifier, including the time they spend travelling, can be cost recovered from the food business being verified. Pavel mentioned the cost-saving aspect is not guaranteed, and hopefully the following will help endorse that there are a number of factors that contribute to the success, speed, and hence cost of successful remote verification. Suffice to say, perhaps it can contribute to cost saving, because New Zealand's a nation of small businesses. Around 95% have less than 20 employees, 70% one-man bands with no employees. So for these small businesses, verifier costs can mount up, especially when their verifier isn't based locally or live around the corner. Some businesses that were literally having to fly in their verifier and face high costs for doing so asked us why they couldn't Skype their verifier instead. They made a good point, so we started to look into whether technology could play a part in verification. We put together an 18-month project to find out whether it was possible to carry out a valid verification of a food business using technology, and whether that remote method could reduce the cost to food businesses. We involved our service design team and a mix of verifiers who brought with them a range of experiences. And we tried out some different technologies during a series of field trials with volunteer food businesses who were keen to innovate and try things out. We held modelling workshops before and after interviews with participants to identify how they were feeling or had found the approach. That provided opportunities to improve on processes and practices, and we observed and recorded developments. And as the trials program progressed, a remote verification process was developed and refined from the feedback received from all parties. And as we worked through the program, we were able to address the concerns or pain points people identified, along with identifying skills and capabilities that a remote verifier under the Food Act needs. And these are the sorts of concerns verifiers expressed to us when first contemplating using technology instead of gathering information on site. We heard them at the first workshop with verifiers when developing remote verification, and again from verifiers being introduced to the remote approach during the COVID pandemic. People say, when I arrive on site, I get an initial feel of a business that gives me an immediate impression of the way the business is being run, and I won't get that online. Verifiers say, when I'm on site, my senses are being bombarded with information. There are smells that will give me clues. Something's just been cleaned or is going off. If I want to, I can touch something to see if it's cold. I might even get a taste sensation in my mouth. And online, I'm going to be deprived of all these senses. They also identify that I've got peripheral vision when I'm on site that allows me to see things going on out of the corner of my eye while speaking with the operator. That helps me confirm procedures that are being put into practice, and I won't have that peripheral vision online. There are natural concerns technology won't work. What happens if it doesn't? And that biggie on trust. And Pavel mentioned that towards the end of his talk, that using technology will make it easier for people to hide something that they don't want me to see. And so during our developments, we identified ways to help manage these concerns and find equivalent ways of doing things remotely that achieve positive results. First, we found technology that works. We identified there are over 1,000 registered Food Act businesses around the country that don't have a locally based verifier and could have the opportunity to take advantage of technology and the remote process. During trials, we tried out smart glasses, among other pieces of hardware, but recognised the reality of getting complex and expensive pieces of equipment to people in out-of-the-way places, expecting it to turn up on time, and expecting people to be able to use it out of the box would be a tall ask and likely to add stresses to the verification process. Plus, the cost of providing, maintaining and couriering devices and ensuring them would all add to verification costs. So for our purposes, it meant the solutions needed to be kept simple and sustainable. During field trials, we also found broadband connectivity rapidly dropped in areas away from population centres. And in these areas, we found live streaming using some technologies was constantly interrupted. Signals dropped out, pictures froze, sound was distorted, and technology actually prolonged the verification process, leading to frustrations. And using this type of technology could be a wasted exercise and end up actually costing more. So we identified the solution is really in the hands of the business operator themselves. Most people now have access to smart devices. Many people use social media, live streaming apps and are comfortable using them. We found social media platforms work well where broadband's limited. And if the operator has access to a smart device, a live streaming app, has Wi-Fi at their business, this should enable a live link to be established with their verifier sitting at home or in their office. And this is readily available and doesn't add to their verification costs. So a remote verification process was developed and refined, which helps address the valid concerns raised by verifiers and food businesses during the trials. Key steps in the process, starting from the top left and moving to the right. Firstly, preparation. The verifier researches the food business to identify whether it meets the criteria that we set for whether remote verification is an option. And if yes, the verifier calls the food business to let the operator know they're due a verification, finds out whether the operator's got the technology available and is interested in trying the remote approach. And if the operator is interested, the verifier then talks them through the remote process and follows up the conversation with an email. That email contains a guide to the remote process. The email also contains a request for information and an agreement for the operator to sign. The request for information lists the copies of documents and records the verifier would like to analyse before their reality check, plus a site plan to help the remote verifier orientate themselves when virtually at the business. And with battery time in smart mobile devices at a premium during the reality check, the verifier wants to maximise the time they spend observing and listening to what the operator has to show and tell. The agreement helps address concerns people will be able to hide things from them. In signing the agreement, the operator agrees, among other things, to follow remote verifier instructions and point the camera at the things the remote verifier directs them to. The agreement makes it clear that if they don't do this, the verifier can take other steps that will ultimately cost the operator more money. So we're now in the center of the top section of the wiring diagram. And when the verifier, excuse me, has the signed agreement and has the requested documents and records, they arrange a time for a technical check. And the technical check addresses a number of those other earlier concerns. It's a chance to make the online connection between the verifier and the business. It ensures the availability of technology and that the technology works at the places around the business the verifier will want to see during the reality check. The technical check ensures technology will deliver quality sound and vision sufficient for the verifier to make their assessment. It enables the verifier to gain a first feel of the business and a perspective of the business to marry up with the site plan, starting from the outside and following the flow of the food through the business. Enables any technology glitches to be fixed ahead of the reality check. It reduces the risk and stress from a fingers crossed the live stream connection will work on the day approach. And it's also an opportunity for the verifier to work the technology with the operator to get them used to receiving directions, such as where to point the camera, switching cameras in their device to alternate between FaceTime and a view of the business that the verifier wants to see. And this coaching will save time during the reality check and also helps build the rapport and trust between the verifier and their customer. The business fortunately doesn't get to see the wiring diagram, and this is the flyer of the process that the operator sees. And all the touch points that they have with the verifier, the operator can ask questions to help them become more comfortable with the process. And at any time, the operator can decide not to proceed with the remote approach if they don't feel comfortable with it. So ahead of the reality check, the verifier will have received and have analysed relevant documents and records, will have been virtually on site and walked through the business, know the technology will work on the day, have some confidence the operator can use the technology and can respond to directions and answer questions about the process. And this enables the verifier to focus the remote reality check itself on the business in action during the live stream link. And for remote verifications under the Food Act, the verifier doesn't make a recording of the reality check. Recording brings with it many complicated legal expectations around information security, where information is stored and who may have access to the stored information. So live streaming keeps clear of the legal pitfalls. So developing the remote verification approach identified the skills and competencies people need to become a competent remote Food Act verifier. And this derives from our work with mainly small businesses with operators who are not specialists in either food safety or technology. The skills and competencies needed by the remote verifiers of these businesses may differ to other remote models, depending on the type of information needing to be gathered, how it's being gathered, who it's being gathered from, and other criteria. As an example, if the only information needed relates to a measurement, it should be relatively straightforward for someone to demonstrate, say, all products in a batch either weigh the same or the same length by demonstrating the measurement online. Becomes a little more involved when remotely interviewing people about the processes and practices they follow in making products. And beyond this, using technology to gain understanding of behaviours to help confirm a level of positivity of business culture becomes increasingly more complex and require a highly developed set of remote auditor skills and competencies. And from their experience with remote reality checks, verifiers tell us they need to be adaptable on a number of levels, as no two businesses or operators are the same. So the best way to engage and proceed with the reality check isn't through a one-size-fits-all approach. People find a conversational style for gathering information is often more logical for the operator, keeps people engaged and quicker for gathering information than just by running through a list of what may seem to the operator to be a seemingly unconnected set of topics or questions. Keeping engagement through active listening, short sentences, simple language, and giving the operator time to think and speak. During the remote verifier training, we have a professional media person giving people the opportunity to see and hear themselves on screen so they understand how others see them. And remote verifiers are having to multitask and deal with a number of uncertainties, engaging the person at the other end, directing them on where to point the camera, seeing and hearing information they need to then process and balance in their head against their understanding of compliance and conformance, as well as maintaining the flow of the verification to gather the information needed against that ticking clock of the operator's battery running down. It's an intense process, and our remote verifiers have told us they can feel as trained by the end of a 2-hour online reality check as they can after a day on site. So those learnings from field trials enabled us to develop a training and assessment process for recognising remote verifiers under the Food Act 2014. For those selected, it starts with a 4-day training and assessment centre consisting of 2 days of training immediately followed by 2 days of assessments that enable the verifier to develop and improve their skills. The next stage for verifiers successfully completing the training and assessment centre involves carrying out an assessed remote verification, and the final assessment is a peer-reviewed remote verification. And successful completion of that enables the verifier to apply for recognition as a remote verifier under the Food Act. So the start of the COVID pandemic response from March 2020 effectively stopped verifiers carrying out on-site visits of food businesses that were due their program verification. There was a danger that if there was no verification service, food businesses could end up operating illegally. There were a small number of trained and recognised remote verifiers at that stage, but not enough to cover all the businesses that would need verifying during restrictions imposed by the response. And we had a unique opportunity to broaden the use of technology to a larger number of Food Act verifiers and a wider range of food businesses, but couldn't hold the interactive 4-day training and assessment centres to develop more recognised remote verifiers. So instead, New Zealand Food Safety captured the essence of the learnings from remote verification in a series of webinars covering the process, practices, techniques and skills for remotely checking food businesses. The webinars delivered this online training to over 300 verifiers throughout April and early May 2020 and focused on seeking assurance about the relevant basic requirements at food businesses. And although the webinars couldn't bring the full intensity of an assessment process, it did enable verifiers to follow a tried and tested approach and build their experiences in using technology to verify and deliver a verification service. And our MPI colleagues in plant exports and animal products also sought our input to help develop remote training and delivery to their sector verifiers as well. So the tried and tested Food Act remote verification approach has helped underpin MPI's ability to maintain verification services through the COVID-19 response. Back in April 2020, the general view was COVID would blow through in a matter of months, and few thought that more than 2 years later, the impacts would still be with us, and not over yet. In the Food Act space, remote checking continues to be used where a COVID risk assessment identifies that it's inadvisable for a verifier to go on site. And with over 5,000 food businesses around New Zealand verified remotely during the COVID pandemic response that are operating under the Food Act, the approach continues to help prevent an overwhelming backlog of overdue verifications from piling up. So we're noticing some benefits to overall to the verification service from having had to use technology, what Pavel referred to as hybrid audits. Verifiers are now carrying out on-site verification again. They're telling us they're incorporating aspects of technology from the remote approach into their verification model, perhaps to gather and analyze records and information, to keep the focus of on-site time on confirming good practices are integral to food business activities. Maybe doing the opening online and saving time actually on site. So at New Zealand Food Safety, we're identifying opportunities to take a stock take of the remote approach to identify how we might move forward with training and assessment to develop more recognised remote verifiers in ways that take into account people's experiences of using technology to seek assurance over the past couple of years. It's very much sort of onwards and upwards. Thank you. I'll hand you back to Tim, but do feel free if you've got any questions outside of session to get in touch with me at MPI. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Chris. If you could stop sharing your screen, and Pavel, if you rejoin with your video, that would be great, thanks. And we do have a little bit of time for a Q&A, so I do welcome any questions from participants. If you have questions for Chris and Pavel. We do have one here from Kathy Welch. Kia ora, Kathy. Chris, I know you touched on this, but how do we convince small and medium food companies of the commercial benefits of investing in technologies to enable remote audits if there is no obvious cost savings for remote audits?
That's a good question. If there are no cost savings, it will probably be hard to convince people who are looking at the bottom line. COVID has really given us a no option position. It's either online or not. So cost saving, in a way, becomes secondary. It's about maintaining a service, and I guess it will also depend on the model that's being used, and identifying, whether there are ways of doing things differently or better that might actually appeal to the business operator, and maybe have an impact on the bottom line ultimately. But I guess from a Food Act's perspective, we do have criteria. In a pre-COVID world, verification remotely wasn't a given, so businesses had to earn that right, if you like.
Thanks, Chris. Pavel, did you have any comment with that question?
Yes, thank you. Just adding to what Chris was talking about, it is not an easy decision, and it might not be immediately clear what is the cost benefit. In my mind, it's a little bit similar to sustainability, where we in some ways might feel this is the right way to do that, but we may not be able to fully monetize the benefits that are coming from these activities. So the message I would have to small businesses is that there are always some expected, unexpected benefits that come out from this process. And of course, we will not expect small or medium companies to invest into satellites or these kind of expensive technologies. But they may, for instance, consider very simple alignment of processes or making their documents easily accessible to auditors and facilitate this pre-audit verification process that Chris was also talking about, and work with the auditors to streamline the process. And there is a high chance that they will get some benefits. And I think Chris has described that process very well. So if there are any other people still considering that, it's a great guidelines to follow.
I was just wondering if I can add something very quickly there, Tim, that for a lot of people, remote people actually prefer face-to-face, and we've been doing quite a lot of partnering with Ministry of Education and with Marai, where people actually like to know who's actually coming into their kitchen or who they're dealing with, and they prefer to do that face to face anyway. So there might always be people might always find that there is some reluctance to switch to technology if people are used to doing face to face.
Thanks, Chris. We do have a couple other questions there. Is there any science or research on developing the relationship with the auditor if you don't already have this? This is especially during long or multi-day audits. We all know the value of coffee, lunchtime, and dinner chats. How do we replicate this in a remote setting?
Carry on, Pavel, you first.
Okay, thank you, Chris. This is a very, very good question. And I think the answer very broadly lies in this notion of hybrid audits, a recognition that there isn't one best way. It's not about remote audit or a face-to-face audit. It's about finding a right balance between these two modes of operandi. And I think if you talk with auditors, there are messages hinting to pros and cons. For example, of course, auditors do miss these interactions, little chats with the people. But at the same time, they also appreciate some time apart where they can go quietly through the data. They can prepare for the audit. So the very brief answer is, yes, there is a research on that, and we probably don't have time to go into much detail, but the general answer is we have to find a right balance.
That sounds really sound, Pavel, especially around that hybrid approach, making more use of offline, getting information and being able to analyze it offline is one of those areas. I made a couple of other notes as well. It's about looking, the fact that the approach that you may take on site for gathering information is not necessarily the way you would do it online. And yes, we know that it's very tiring. So therefore, maybe you need to break it down into bite-sized chunks, that it's not all going to happen at once. It happens in a progressive way with short online aspects that can then be analyzed a bit that will actually help identify what happens next during the verification. So yeah, it's other ways of looking at things what may be a 2-day on site is going to be done in a different way when you do it online, recognizing that. Focus on the things you really need to understand.
And I think just very briefly adding to that, the aspect of flexibility here is very important.
Yep.
And it's not only a flexibility of auditors, for example, when the audit is quite complex and we may need a special auditor just tapping in for a particular part of the audit, but it's also in terms of availability of senior managers, for example, in organizations. And one of the findings from our research was that senior managers and leaders in organizations became more involved in audits during the pandemic because they had this ability to drop in to a session online.
Thank you, Pavel. We've got time for one more question, and this is targeted for you, Pavel. How do you see the role of preparation in remote auditing? We have noted the central role of preparation by auditors prior to deployment. This is emerging as a key requirement as it does reduce the potential for rapid adaptation as can occur on site. Another key aspect is that the auditors must deploy a very flexible approach when conducting the remote audit rather than overly defined views, for example, on potential non-conformities.
Thank you, John, for the question. I think this is really spot on. And if I would highlight one of the key benefits of remote auditing during pandemic is this function of a preparation for the audit that is done offsite. And most of the auditors will tell you a very similar story. We had time to prepare. We had time to consider various options. Many auditors would start to do little investigation. That is, for example, quite notable in the context of modern slavery, where the auditors can call some NGOs or their local informants, and in some ways collect insights from this broader stakeholder base to inform them about the audit itself. And in the food context might be very similar, and especially this move of a focus from individual non-conformities to seeing very broadly the organization is something that, if the remote audit is well planned for, could very well serve. I'm sure Chris has got also a few comments on that, because that was part of your presentation, Chris, as well, right?
Yeah, thanks, Pavel. Yes, we all know that expression that proper preparation prevents pathetically poor performance, and that really holds with the remote approach, because doing your homework and understanding the business and understanding what you are going to be verifying and business approaches, their previous performance when it's a regulatory audit, especially, and how they're performing now, and doing your online research, having a look at their website. What are their customers saying about them? All the bits of information that you can glean. And hear people say, "Oh, preparation, it takes a long time. We don't have time for that." But you'll save time later on if you do your homework.
Okay, thank you. Great answers. Just noting we're being on time to finish up, so we will draw it to a conclusion now. I'd like to extend a big thanks to Pavel and Chris for your presentations, excellent and really clear. I'd also like to thank participants who have dialed in today. Hopefully you've got something out of it. Both Pavel and Chris have approachable if you'd like to contact them outside of this webinar. Thank you, everybody, today. Enjoy your day. Thank you very much.
So take care.
Take care. Thank you.